Working is presented by Maya Strategy Group, a leading market research and strategy consulting firm, helping clients in the pet care and animal health industries navigate strategic challenges for almost 2 decades. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pet Working. I'm Peter Kenseth, Vice President at Maya Strategy Group, and I'm joined today by Dr. James Templeman, Director of Nutrition at Primal Pet Food and an adjunct professor at the University of Guelph. James and I are going to kind of dive into a topic that we began discussing at SuperZoo almost a month ago, and looking into the nutritional differences between minimally processed diets, more natural diets along the lines of raw, freeze-dried, fresh refrigerated, gently cooked, and how those compare to more processed foods, in the kibble space, and the balance between cost, convenience, and nutrition that all pet parents are trying to meet. So we're going to kind of dive into Primal is really out at the forefront, putting at some studies showing the increased nutritional value that you can find for your pets in freeze-dried, raw, gently cooked diets. But also understanding that there's an economic reality for a lot of pet parents that you can't switch your pet completely to these foods because they are more expensive, and that there does need to be some of that cost savings and convenience that's offered by a kibble diet. So we're going to get into that. And thank you so much, James. Welcome to the show. And thanks for joining me on Pet Working.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter. It's my pleasure. It was nice to be able to meet you briefly at SuperZoo, and it's great to get a chance to dive a little bit deeper in the discussion.
Yeah. So, James, I know at SuperZoo we talked, you have a series of papers coming out. I think you mentioned that the first one is out already now.
We just got the acceptance, so everybody can keep their eyes peeled in the journal Animal Science. Probably around this time in October, it'll be in its fully published in print form. So it was really exciting to see that first one get published. Our second just got submitted for publication, and our third's kind of in the late stages of draft. So hopefully this kind of completed series will be out in full publication around spring 2024 at the latest. So really exciting for us here at Primal. It's been a big step and something we haven't necessarily done prior to this, and it's been a really great opportunity. I just want to also give a shout out to the University of Illinois and the Kelly Swanson Laboratory for their collaboration with us and all their hard work on the ground with their students carrying out this research. So it's been a really fun last 2 years of doing this with them, and just kind of excited to see where it takes us next.
Yeah, that is super exciting. And so you mentioned this first paper that you just got approval for focuses largely on primal diets across the span of the primal range, and sort of providing documented scientific evidence of the nutritional benefits that can be obtained through eating diets across the primal range.
Yeah, so for this first piece, we actually got to present some of this research at the American Society of Animal Science conference last June. So that was nice to get our first kind of expose in front of some other researchers and some other industry members. So this first paper was kind of our first stepping stone into these next two that are a little bit more in depth. And we really just looked at comparing a variety of our frozen and freeze-dried products, a couple products differing in some freeze-dried methodologies and technologies. And we really kind of wanted to take the assessment of digestibility, which is very kind of commonly been assessed across minimally processed pet foods. And we just want to dive a little bit deeper. Rather than looking strictly at macronutrient or apparent total tract digestibility, we had got to use a really interesting and unique methodology from the University of Illinois called the Sectorized Rooster model. And we look to actually assess standardized amino acid digestibility specifically in these diets. So it just kind of takes the broad concept of digestibility and really focuses on some specific essential nutrients being essential amino acids. So it was a really, really cool project. We got some really interesting data out of it showing really high levels of amino acid digestibility across our different formats of feeding, and also got a little bit of an indication in terms of bioavailability of amino acids as opposed or alongside digestibility with some different kind of reactive lysine metrics, for instance. So giving us a bit of an indication in terms of how processing steps and ingredient selection may affect digestibility and bioavailability of amino acids. So it was really fun and a nice, again, stepping stone into these next two papers we've got in the works.
Yeah, and it's great to hear you mention, that the phrase, digestibility and bioavailability. I kicked off SuperZoo, meeting with you and Jillian at the Primal booth, and over the next 3 days, as I was walking the floor, and our team was walking the floor, one of the big things we saw was an increased use of digestibility, bioavailability, not only in minimally processed natural brands, but seeing mineral absorption, nutrient availability messaged in more processed foods where they're adding supplements, and as we've seen this rise and shift towards functionality becoming table stakes in pet food marketing. It's almost now becoming a situation where manufacturers are differentiating in the effectiveness of their functionality, and when maybe James, you could explain for the lay people out there, for your average pet parent, your shopper, when you see things like digestibility and bioavailability on a pet food label, what specifically are those referring to, and how can you break down those claims to understand what is best to give your pet?
Yeah, so you may not necessarily see these directly on the label of a pet food. Some people may refer to diets as highly digestible or that kind of thing, but you likely won't see these values quantitatively on a package itself. But a lot of companies leverage data like that very effectively on their websites and so on, in ways in which their consumers can kind of identify these aspects for very specific diets and formulas. But I guess digestibility is a nice one because I think it is a bit of a more, consumer friendly research outcome. Very oftentimes there's a bit of a challenge in terms of translating some of the more complex research outcomes to the general consumer. But I think digestibility is a really nice one in the sense that it is simply an indication of how much of a diet or how much of a specific nutrient within that diet can be digested, absorbed, and potentially utilized for its intended purpose within the animal that's consumed it. And I think that just kind of it makes sense. It's a really kind of valuable, nice indicator in terms of the ingredients that were used in that diet, how it was processed, because all of these factors can play into increasing or decreasing the digestibility of the diet holistically or of specific nutrients within that diet. So again, just a really nice, marketing tool, but not just marketing, because it is indeed a really valuable outcome in terms of if you have a diet that's 50% digestible, it means 50% of that diet is basically being sent out the other end of your dog and cat without actually being used within the animal itself. So in terms of, value for your money, you want to be able to feed an animal something and have 80-90+% of that diet, 89%, 90% of those nutrients within that diet actually being used for the reason that we're putting it in there in the first place. So I just think it's a really relatable metric and something that, again, gives some nice kind of quantitative punch to a product or to a diet line.
Right. And you mentioned, the process, the method of processing and ingredient selection influencing digestibility. Could you outline for us, differentiation between digestibility and bioavailability and that?
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky there. When you get between digestibility and bioavailability, it gets a little more scientific than a lot of consumers will generally understand. Digestibility means it can be digested. So when you consume a product, it goes through your gastrointestinal tract and it's broken down by various enzymes and it's digested or absorbed out of that gastrointestinal tract. Bioavailability indicates how much of that is actually used for its specific purpose within the animal. And so when I said that digestibility is a nice indicator in terms of things like, for instance, heat or high heat processing, bioavailability can be assessed with things like reactive to total lysine. And that may seem a little bit foreign to some, but you're starting to see it come out a little bit more in some of these more research publications because, for instance, lysine is an amino acid that's very commonly bound essentially to simple sugars in a reaction called the Maillard reaction. And this can
Right.
basically occur because, for instance, one is high heat processing can induce this reaction. And when lysine becomes bound within this reaction, it may still appear as being digestible, but it's actually no longer bioavailable to the animal that's consumed it. So it's kind of that
Right.
next step of availability of dietary nutrients and really how they're actually, again, used for their intended purpose within the animal that's consumed instead of just being, excreted, whether in the, in the urine or or the feces the other way.
Right. And so when we're looking, and I think this clues a lot of people in, and as to why terms like minimally processed and lacking fillers are important. I think it's something that we as many things in pet food we see flowing down from our philosophy as human food consumers. You see human food consumption gravitating towards more natural, less processed, whole food nutrition. Um, it's a similar philosophy within the pet space, right? Obviously, if the less you are processing a food, the less you're exposing it to high heat, whether it's gently cooked or freeze dried or air dried or frozen raw, the more nutrients you're preserving in that food, correct?
To some degree, digestibility is a little bit interesting in the sense that, and I use this phrase a lot, I don't know if a lot of people do, but I think there's a bit of a U-shaped curve associated with digestibility when it comes to, for instance, processing. And it really depends on your ingredients and your diet matrix itself, sorry. When it comes to things like proteins, there is to a small degree, a little bit of heat processing can actually induce benefits when it comes to digestibility. But very quickly, when you get to either duration of heating or temperature of heating, you begin to see some denaturation occurring, some of this Maillard reaction occurring, and then you're kind of tipping off that other end of the scale and getting some deleterious effects with regard to digestibility. But then, for instance, you have things like plant-based ingredients and specifically plant proteins, and you can actually get a lot of benefits associated with a little bit of heat processing, some solubility or solubilization of starches, or some inhibition of anti-nutritional factors. And these things can actually benefit digestibility. So again, a bit of a U-shaped curve, but it really comes down to the specific ingredients being used. And primarily when you're talking about meats or high protein components of a diet, at least on the animal side of proteins, you're typically getting more ideal digestibility coefficients coming out of less processed ingredients versus more processed when it comes to heat processing.
Sure. And so, within that, you mentioned that there is that slight advantage to some heat. Do you see that being, a big driver? Obviously, we've seen gently cooked, fresh refrigerated, whatever nomenclature you want to use for it, really take off in the last 2 years. Is that, do you feel like that's a big driver of that? Is that, we're getting, that is the optimal balance of the right levels of heat being applied to processing?
I don't necessarily know if this kind of growth in the gently cooked or sous vide area is necessarily related to that aspect specifically. I think there's a lot of other valuable attributes that come with that gently cooked process. Even if it just comes down to a little bit of a more stable product or something that appears to be similar to what we would consume, because we all know that humanization is this kind of, big trend in the pet industry where if we like something that's got, a little bit of cooked aspect and those nice little bits and pieces of all those cooked, proteins and vegetables, then we want our pets to be consuming a similar product. And now you can get that's minimally processed, but still kind of appears to be very similar to what we would consume. So I do think that there's value to it when it comes to those, again, that U shape of digestibility, but I don't think that's necessarily been the driver in that sector of this industry really taking off. I think it's a lot of, how high quality those products can be, being, sous vide or gently cooked within its own, within its own moisture and its own retention of nutrients. And I think there's a lot of other value that comes with it that's kind of not necessarily that the digestibility component is the main driver here.
That makes sense. So You mentioned also the ingredients as being a big driver in the digestibility and the bioavailability. Is that getting down to the type of ingredient, or is that the quality of the ingredient? One thing I've seen a lot more coming out of this year, and I feel like maybe something that we see in the future, is the shift towards regenerative agriculture and nutrient content of plant-based materials or even livestock, varying the nutrient content varying based on the soils and in which they're grown and the manner in which they're farmed. And there are studies coming out showing that materials that either produce or livestock that are grown on regenerative soils and farmed using regenerative agriculture have like 10 to 20 times the nutrient content of livestock or produce that is raised on conventional farmland. Mm-hmm. Is that when you're referring to digestibility and bioavailability, is that getting down to the quality of the ingredient that you're starting with, or do you find that there's certain types of proteins or produce that retain that contribute to better digestibility and bioavailability?
No, I mean, personally, and again, I'm a little biased being a formulator and someone that focuses a little bit more on raw materials than finished products. I am certainly a proponent and an advocate of the fact that the quality of your ingredients, the processing of your ingredients, the sourcing of your ingredients prior to their introduction into a diet matrix and prior to that diet being then continuously or further processed, the ingredients are the main drivers here. It's one of those quality in, quality out, garbage in, garbage out kind of analogies here. And that's why, at Primal specifically, we focus so much on sourcing high quality products and products that have been processed to the specific or specificities and levels that we want them to be. And it's specifically because of that. It's you can change a lot about how a diet performs if a diet is created using high quality, specifically processed ingredients versus low quality and poorly processed. And even if you process the diet the exact same way, you're getting very different outcomes out the other side. So it's definitely one of those quality in, quality out kind of concepts here when it comes to you sourcing ingredients that are meeting those specific criteria that you want them to. So I'm absolutely on the belief side that the ingredients make the difference here.
Sure. Now, when we're looking, obviously, Primal is known for its rigorous sourcing process and using high quality natural ingredients. So many other players in the space are as well. At a certain point, when we're looking at, the introduction, addition, incorporation of these more minimally processed production methods into your pet's diet, at what point, do you start seeing benefits? We saw messaging at the show. I think Instinct was touting, you can start seeing the benefits of feeding freeze-dried or raw, with as little as 20% of your pet's diet. When I was talking to Stella and Shuey, they're talking about, we're really just trying to get everybody to feed a little bit raw. Obviously, there's a financial component there because feeding raw or freeze-dried or fresh refrigerated exclusively is way more expensive than feeding kibble, and way more expensive than mixing in freeze-dried or raw, using it as a topper or a mix-in to become a component of your pet's diet. But where do you see the optimal levels being? And what are your recommendations as an animal nutritionist, for what people should be looking to do for their pet?
I mean, to be entirely honest, that's tough for me to say. I'm a data-driven guy, and I don't necessarily know if there's this exact quantitative level where you're gaining benefit over not. I am certainly of the opinion that any introduction of something that's, again, less processed, something that's more natural into the diet is always going to be valuable. You're never not going to have that value, even if it's just simply the introduction of something more varietal to your pet's diets. It's how we thrive as humans. It's how a lot of species will thrive, is having variety in their bowl, right? So, and again, we are of the understanding that there's a lot of consumers out there that can't, for convenience sake, for food storage sake, for financial sake, cannot exclusively feed a raw or minimally processed diet. So we are there in the thinking that anything that you can add, any component that's introduced to that pet's bowl, will add variety to the diet, maybe give a little more interest in that diet or that bowl to the animal that's consuming it, but also bring some of those valuable characteristics that minimally processed pet foods do. Again, introducing some more highly digestible nutrients or more highly digestible amino acids to the diet, or introducing a little bit more moisture to the bowl, or, these kind of features. I don't think you can go wrong, but I don't necessarily, again, as a very data driven guy, I don't know if there's this exact set point or threshold that you can achieve. I think it's about finding that appropriate balance, making sure you're not over or under feeding in terms of just general caloric intake, and then ensuring that your pet gets a little bit of diet variety, because we all enjoy a little bit of variety in our diet. So that's definitely kind of the camp that I would sit in, at least.
Yeah. You raised a few, bells for me there, in talking about the variety. We hear a lot about the rotational diet and the benefits. I definitely try with my dog Peony to, keep a core kibble as about half of her bowl, and then put in, freeze dried, and rotate through proteins to, mix up the nutrients and amino acids, similar to how I would with my diet. Is that, am I interpreting that the right way? And then, I guess the other thing that, I've seen a lot of lately, and I think the Farmer's Dog has been a real big proponent of in the YouTube commercials I've seen from them, and the education they give is talking about, and we even hear this, in the discussion of regenerative agriculture, is that, when you are feeding minimally processed or more nutrient rich, nutrient dense foods, you can actually feed less and achieve similar levels of satiety. So you can you can create a situation where your pet is still feeling full, losing weight, attaining more healthful levels. Could you talk a little bit about rotational diet and
absolutely. I will first off just preface this with the fact that I understand that there is definitely animals out there that do not do well when they're continuously introduced to different diet components. And if you are an owner of one of those animals, I empathize with you, because I have one of our cats that does not do well being introduced to different diets. So if you are one of those people and you find a diet that works for your pet and they enjoy eating every day and it maintains a healthy body weight and general health, then by all means proceed as is. But if you are an owner of a pet that enjoys a little variety and actually does well in terms of response to changing diet, then I think there is a ton of value to it. There's starting to be some literature coming out in terms of the value in the gut microbiome, with introducing some variety, and not just diet variety, but it's nutrient variety. Right? Introducing some new fibers to the diet, introducing some new proteins, some new fats, again, some more plant-based material. These are always going to expose the gut to something new, and, hopefully generate a little bit more diversity and species evenness in the populations of microbes you have, rolling around your gut, and the same with your dogs and cats. So there's definitely value to that. It very well may help them avoid things like hypersensitivities to food. I mean, we know the same thing. If you have a child that's never consumed a tree nut and they get to 12 or 13 years old and consume their first, product, and they have an allergenic response, it's, very likely associated with them not being exposed to those kinds of things in earlier life. So I think there's a lot of value to it, specifically when it comes to young animals as well. That value is not going to deteriorate as your animals age, but if you can get a little bit of variety into your puppies or your kittens' bowls, and again, they receive it well and they're eager to consume, then I think there's always going to be value to that.
Sure. And then how about, the idea of, more nutrient dense foods, less processed foods contributing to satiety?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all just comes down strictly to how energy dense we can create products when we are doing it. Again, if you think of a lot of raw or minimally processed diets, they're quite high in protein, a little bit higher in fat. And because of that, we can create a very nutrient dense product. And with that density, you can then facilitate feeding of less mass of that product to your animal. And I think that's also going to be valuable as well. You do get some, anecdotal benefits that come with that. Things like reduced, fecal quantity. You're going to be out scooping in the yard a little bit less than you may have previously by feeding large quantities of a lower energy density diet. But at the end of the day, as again, somebody who has always been a bit of a proponent of appropriate weight and weight maintenance, it all comes down to following the feeding guidelines of any specific product to, the specificity of that. Like, these guidelines are developed specifically for the product you are feeding. And, it's important, obviously, to feed off of how your animal responds. If you're following guidelines exactly and they're losing a little bit of weight, maybe it means you need to bump it up a bit, but it's all about that weight maintenance and how you can achieve that. Again, in the case of minimally processed or raw diets, you're typically achieving that by feeding less. But it's just all about finding that balance and making sure that you're following those guidelines appropriately and monitoring the weight of your pet and the health of your pet, and listening to your veterinarians when they have feedback on changing how much they're consuming or what they're consuming. But it is a lot of value to feeding that very energy dense diet, or part of the diet being that very energy dense component, because the animal just simply needs to consume less to be satiated and meet their energy and nutrient requirements.
Right. It's an interesting, when you talk about guidelines, right? We see what should pet parents think about, if my kibble recommends that I feed, 1 cup twice a day, what should I be thinking about if I'm going to be introducing freeze-dried, raw, fresh? Should it be a 1-to-1 substitution, maintaining that 1 cup and replacing half the cup with, a freeze-dried, pellet, or a, scoop of raw frozen? How do you think about that? And, and the other half that, you mentioned is, with the veterinarian recommendations, I know one of the big challenges for a lot of minimally processed diet manufacturers is getting that buy-in from the veterinarian. We saw at Western Vet earlier this year, the Farmer's Dog had one of the biggest booths there. Primal was there, Instinct was there, Just Food for Dogs was there. And there does seem to be, this dichotomy within the veterinary community around, the safety and efficacy of minimally processed diets versus more processed forms of nutrition. What's your recommendation on incorporation, and what do you see, from the vet community around?
So for the incorporation concept, it comes down to following those guidelines, but also if you're doing it with the understanding that you want to create this meal for your dog that's going to contain, a half kibble and a quarter freeze-dried raw and a quarter frozen raw, or whatever it may be, just simply understanding that if you are fulfilling half of that dietary caloric requirement with kibble, that if you're following the guidelines and it recommends 1 cup of that product to fulfill the entire, that you're feeding half that portion and then following it appropriately for the other components. And I mean, in terms of, we also understand that animals are getting treats and they're getting, a little bit here and there. Maybe you have some training treats, or maybe you're going out on a walk and you want something high value to bring along with you. All of this does account towards your animal's daily energy requirement and daily nutrient requirement. We always kind of give the rule of thumb of like 10% of their caloric intake can or should come from those maybe high value items, those treats, those toppers. But it all just simply comes back to understanding that if you're feeding, that cup of kibble, that you need to understand if you also want to feed that half cup of freeze-dried raw, that you need to have the combination of that, of the calories, the combination of the, the protein and the fat that's going in, and really understand that it's a, holistic addition to your diets or to your pet's diet. And it's challenging. We understand that it's always challenging to try and keep on top of that, especially if you do want 2 or 3 different things in that pet's bowl. But, a pet with the ideal body weight will be, happier. They'll, have that nice, long, healthy lifespan, and they'll be better for it regardless if you put in that little bit of time and effort to really calculate it out appropriately. As for your mention of the vet community and the kind of the challenge in terms of minimally processed pet food, making its way into that acceptance within the vet space, it's without question something that we, deal with and have tried to manage the best we can for quite a few years now. We've had a veterinary outreach program at Primal. I don't want to put an exact date on this because I don't know. I think probably around 6 to 7 years now. And, this was before my time of joining. So, these are stories from my colleagues, but, they used to go to some of these larger vet conferences, and over a 2 or 3 day period, they'd maybe only be able to have 10 or 15 conversations. And out of those 10 or 15 conversations, maybe one of them would go well, get past the first 2 or 3 sentences of the discussion. But, the perception is changing. We now go to these conferences, and if you're at a booth for 2 or 3 days, you now have 100 or 200 conversations, and maybe only one of those is negative, right? So it's really kind of flipped. And I think it's just coming with them being more understanding of their clients' needs and wants, right? Like and being a little more confident in making recommendations for their clients if their client is already or wants to feed a minimally processed product. And it's why it's important that companies like us and Thrive and these companies are making appearances at conferences to really show that we can do this well. We can have complete and balanced and safe minimally processed products that are backed by science, that have nutritionists or veterinarians formulating these products, that they're held to the highest of quality and highest of standards. And it's interesting too, because I think a lot of the wariness in the vet community and in a lot of different academic communities comes simply from a dearth of publicly available literature describing nutritional and health related outcomes from the feeding of these products. And now we are starting to see these publications start to populate the space more and more and more. And I think that is also going to be a really strong driver in terms of trying to shift a little bit of this perception, and again, show that there is companies out there that are doing this really, really well and are taking quality standards to the highest level. And again, are formulating these products to truly be complete and balanced. And I think it's just, every step we take is a positive one. And we're slowly starting to break down these barriers, but it's not easy. It's not going to happen overnight or in a year's time, but the progress is evident at these conferences in particular. We're getting chances to speak at these conferences now and get well-attended seminars. And it's just getting that knowledge out there and translating it appropriately. And again, most importantly, having some research to actually support these findings and really give a little bit of credibility and validity to some of these outcomes. So we're getting there. It's just it's a long road, and one that's never going to be easy.
Yeah. And I'm sure things like your papers, as you said, that's probably going to resonate with a veterinarian more than anything else. Is if you can give them that science-backed data, that they're doctors of medicine, and just like our doctors would tell you, look, I've reviewed the research. There's evidence to show that this can be effective. So no, that's great to hear. James, I know we're coming up on time, but I did want to kind of close it. I know at Primal you and in our conversation with Jillian earlier, she was mentioning Matt Koss has always said, it's really about adding these minimally processed ingredients to the bowl, not replacing kibble. And some minimally processed manufacturers out there really take an anti-kibble approach. And then there's others that, really just want to get a piece of the bowl, want to impart those nutritional benefits. Can you talk a little bit about, I know we talked about, mixing it in with kibble, but like if, you are like the majority of people and financial constraints dictate that I'm not going to be able to feed exclusively minimally processed, I'm going to have to mix with kibble for cost and convenience sake. What can you expect to see? If you've been feeding exclusively kibble, what kind of changes can you expect to see in your pet?
As a researcher and a scientist, I never love to maybe highlight or discuss, anecdotal benefits or characteristics that would come with feeding. But, you may just start to see some changes associated with the function of their gut. Maybe it comes down to having an animal that's had really poor quality stools for a considerable period of time, and maybe you introduce a new aspect to their bowl, and maybe it is raw, maybe it is minimally processed, maybe it is gently cooked, and maybe you start to see some changes associated with the function of the gut with a bit of a higher quality stool, or maybe even less stool for you to pick up every day out of the backyard. You may see some indications when it comes to the desire to consume the diet as well, right? I think we start to see that as a really material aspect, and we enjoy or like to enjoy what we consume, and it's really, I think, nice and exciting for us as pet owners to maybe see our pets want to and have that desire to consume as well, and maybe that comes with the simple addition of a couple crumbled nuggets of freeze dried over top of their base kibble, or a little bit of a high value topper added to their bowl. Or maybe you're using some higher moisture products. Maybe you have a dog or a cat that doesn't necessarily have that outright desire to voluntarily drink. Moisture is this really, really important aspect of diet management, and one that's really often overlooked. We think of protein, fat, and carbohydrates as our, big macronutrients of concern, but water plays a really important role in metabolism and in maintenance of overall health. So if you have a dog or a cat that's not so willing to always be at their water bowls after eating their food, then maybe you want to introduce a little bit of high moisture to the diet with a frozen product, or again with one of these gently cooked diets. So you can get lots of these really valuable outcomes there, that you don't need a lengthy research study to identify, right? We can see how a pet is more eager to consume, or maybe that they're now, getting that little extra moisture in their diet that they're not willing to consume themselves. There's definitely these kind of material, observable outcomes that can certainly be associated, but and the rest of it, a lot of these other anecdotal aspects are what we're doing research to try and validate it, to try and give a little bit of empirical evidence to show that impact in the gut environment, or maybe that impact related to digestibility or modulation of the gut microbiome. So some of these other characteristics we can hopefully get a little bit of data over these next couple of years to really show and give a little bit of support for.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the moisture content. So often we see these minimally processed diets compared to kibble, but canned food is generally fairly processed as well. You may be getting the moisture benefits from it, but if you're looking to move to more minimally processed, like you said, maybe frozen raw or fresh, gently cooked might be a better option to introduce more nutrients and moisture into your pet's bowl.
Yeah, absolutely. I think previously it had always been, if you wanted something high moisture, something that was more calorically dense, or something that was higher protein or higher fat, the recommendations would typically be a canned product. And it's, for some consumers, that still may be the choice, but it's nice for us to now have options out there in the minimally processed or alternative pet food space that can meet a lot of those same criteria of being higher moisture, a little more bulk to it, higher protein, typically higher fat. So it's just nice to have those kind of comparable products out there in the minimally processed space for consumers to make their decisions based on. So yeah, it's really nice to start to see some of that introduction into this industry.
Yeah, it's very cool. And we're looking forward to seeing your papers come out to kind of provide additional scientific gravitas and backing to a lot of the anecdotal findings that are already out there in the community. Very excited to kind of see where the next frontier in animal nutrition is as the minimally processed philosophy continues to take hold. So James, thank you so much for your time. I think this has been fantastic. I hope everyone out there enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the time to hang out with me and James today. And James, I don't know if you have any last words.
No, I just want to say thank you again, Peter, for the opportunity. It's been lots of fun. I'd like to get a chance to talk about some of these things. It takes me a little bit out of my regular responsibilities in my day-to-day life, and it's pretty refreshing and a lot of fun for me to talk about these kind of things. So yeah, thank you again. It was great connecting with you at SuperZoo, and I'm glad that it turned into a continued discussion.
Yeah, and we'll look forward to keeping in touch going forward. Everyone, this is Dr. James Templeman, the Director of Nutrition at Primal Pet Foods and an adjunct professor at the University of Guelph. I'm Peter Kenseth, Vice President at my Strategy Group and founder of Pet Working. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll talk again soon. Pet Working is presented by Maya Strategy Group, a leading market research and strategy consulting firm, helping clients in the pet care and animal health industries navigate strategic challenges for almost 2 decades.